Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. You're not learning about epic battles, royal courts, or knights in gleaming armor. Nope. Tonight, you're sliding barefoot into a dim medieval hovel, hay pricking your toes with the candlelight flickering ominously over the straw bed that smells faintly of turnips and something worse. The fire crackles low, the dog snoring in the corner, and your mother-in-law is literally sleeping 3 feet away. Welcome to the real medieval world of sex, love, and maybe a little pea-stained shame. You probably won't survive this, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing who's drifting off around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up itchy. No, not that kind of itchy. Although you'll get to that kind of itchy later. Right now, it's just the hay mattress poking through the worn linen sheet. You've slept in your undertunic again, because it's freezing. The tiny stone house you're in is damp and cluttered. No windows, just a hole for smoke and light. The air smells like cabbage stew and sheep grease. Outside, the rooster hasn't even crowed, but your mother-in-law is already stirring the ashes. Your wife or husband, depending on your medieval luck, is snoring beside you. There's no privacy. Zero. This is what intimacy looks like when you're a peasant. 5 people in one room, all pretending not to hear anything when someone farts or shifts a little too enthusiastically in the night. You lie still, eyes on the rafters, wondering, how did people even get together in this world? Sex wasn't glamorous, it wasn't romantic, it was survival, and half the time it was just an attempt to get warm. Now let's be honest. You're probably imagining 2 hot medieval lovers bathed in candlelight, whispering sweet nothings in Old French while lace falls off a shoulder. Cute. But most of the time, sex was about making babies and hoping none of them died before their 2nd birthday. Also, real talk, the mattress might contain literal mice. This is why your partner insists on a plank of wood under the straw. Not for comfort, for vermin control. There's no pillow talk, there's no Marvin Gaye, there's just a creaking sound, and then someone coughs and shifts on the floor near your feet. That's right, your wife's cousin is also here for the winter. Medieval family life is basically a roommate sitcom, minus the jokes and with more dysentery. So, how did people express love, lust, or anything close to desire? Very, very carefully. For starters, they didn't even see each other naked that often. Laundry was a luxury, so underclothes stayed on unless you were wealthy enough to afford extra tunics. Sex might happen through a slit in a chemise. Think medieval glory hole, except everyone's cold and someone probably has fleas. Speaking of which, you scratch your leg again. But here's the kicker. Despite the absolute lack of mood lighting, medieval people still fell in love. They passed secret notes, they exchanged tokens, like a lock of hair or a ribbon that hasn't been washed in months. And they had intense whispered conversations in meadows and behind ale barrels. You shuffle over to the fire to warm your hands. The house cat blinks at you from a corner. It probably ate a rat last night and now thinks it's royalty. Love stories in this era didn't start with flowers. They started with alliances, or cows. If you were lucky, you might get to choose your spouse based on mild affection, or at least a shared hatred for the same feudal lord. You stretch, careful not to knock over the chamber pot, and think about the couples you know. The miller and his wife? He grunts. She sighs. They coexist. The blacksmith and his apprentice? Well, everyone's seen them sneaking glances. And here's your morning reality check. The church is in your business. Sex wasn't just private, it was regulated. Not officially, maybe, but unofficially, God was keeping track. And so was the priest. You recall yesterday's sermon, the part where Father Alaric listed off the sinful acts that would land you straight into hellfire. Missionary only. no Sundays, and definitely no laughing during. But you did hear something from the traveling merchant last week. A tale of a noblewoman who used honey as lubrication and got caught by her confessor. Now her estate pays double penance in coin and goats. You rub your eyes, still tired. The church's control was deeply psychological. People genuinely feared eternal damnation. There were entire guidebooks written by monks, manuals that explained when, where, and how sex could be sinless. Spoiler, almost never, and still, people found loopholes. Your neighbor, she pretends to confess, but everyone knows she's been secretly seeing the falconer from the next village. They meet under the guise of herb gathering. Real subtle, Agnes. Medieval intimacy wasn't just complicated. It was a mix of desperation, devotion, dirt, and sometimes surprisingly, tenderness. Yes, even in all this gloom, couples found ways to connect. A hand held under the blanket, a laugh shared over stale bread, a whispered joke about the priest's hairline. As the sun creeps in through the smoke hole, you watch the light fall across your partner's face. Their hair's a mess. Their breath smells like onion gruel. But there's a softness there. Something real. And maybe that's all it took in a world with no deodorant and no privacy to make it work. You step outside. The air is sharp and damp, the sky gray. You squint toward the horizon. Somewhere a cart creaks on the road. A dog barks. A monk chants in the distance. And just like that, your brain shifts. The embarrassment of last night? Faded. The awkwardness? Normal. Because this is life. And in the medieval world, survival and sensuality were stitched together. Uncomfortable. Messy. Necessary. Your day begins. And the mystery of medieval sex? Well, it's going to get weirder from here. The morning chill bites at your cheeks as you step back inside. Your fingers are numb, and the inside of the hovel is just marginally warmer than the outside, because insulation hasn't been invented yet and the fire barely holds a flame. Someone hands you a crust of stale bread, the communal breakfast, and you nibble quietly. Nobody talks much in the mornings. Probably because there's not much to say, and also because everyone can hear everything. That awkward groaning from the night before? Yeah, everyone heard it, but nobody says a word. It's an unspoken rule. In a home with zero privacy, everyone pretends they're deaf. Let's talk about that bed you woke up in. It wasn't exactly inviting. A wooden frame, if you're lucky. A bag of straw stuffed into a rough linen sack. Over time, the straw breaks down, molds, and becomes home to an ecosystem of bugs. You fluff it occasionally, maybe add new straw after the harvest, but mostly you just live with the itch. And the smell. And yet it's in that bed where sex happens. Sometimes in silence, sometimes with muffled giggles, occasionally while someone else sleeps on the other side of a hanging curtain, which doesn't help much. Sound travels. Now, for the upper class, things are a bit more lavish. Wealthy households had canopy beds with actual curtains for privacy, feather mattresses, sheets, sometimes even warmed stones placed under the covers. But the irony? The more comfortable the bed, the less likely it was used for romance. Noble marriages were political contracts. Intimacy was scheduled, calculated, and full of pressure to produce heirs. Not exactly hot. You shift your weight on the uneven floorboards. A breeze finds its way in through the door. Someone farts. Ah, romance. But let's talk beliefs, because medieval people had opinions about what was proper in the bedroom. And a lot of those opinions came directly from the church. If you think your strict Catholic grandma had some weird rules, buckle up. Medieval clergy kept a running list of do's and don'ts that could make a modern therapist faint. Sex for pleasure? Sin. Sex on feast days? Sin. Sex while pregnant? Sin. Sex on Wednesdays, Fridays, or Sundays? Definitely sin. Sex while naked? That's a bigger sin. Sex in daylight? Whoa, there's Satan. It's exhausting. There were entire charts. Yes, charts. About when you were allowed to have intercourse. A married couple might only have 10 or 12 allowed days per month, depending on which theologian they followed. And those days didn't line up with ovulation because nobody knew what ovulation was. So, fertility was basically a dice roll with shame for dessert. But did people follow the rules? You glance across the room. The neighbor's youngest child was born during Lent. Enough said. People tried to follow the rules. Or at least they pretended. They confessed. They did penance. They lit candles and muttered apologies in Latin. But the reality was far more human. Desire didn't disappear just because a monk said it should. Let's go deeper into those beliefs, shall we? One of the biggest ideas floated around was that sex drained your life force. It was thought to weaken your body, dull your mind, and make you more susceptible to disease. For men especially, the loss of seed was seen as losing your vitality, which is ironic considering how obsessed medieval medical texts were with balancing your humors. One scroll claims too much sex causes your brain to overheat. Another warns of melancholic vapors if you go too long without. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were sincerely followed by the average person or mostly spouted by celibate monks who hadn't gotten laid since harvest season 3 years ago. Still, these ideas shaped behavior. Men were supposed to be dominant, but not animalistic. Women were supposed to be passive, but not frigid, and everyone was supposed to feel guilty. A perfect setup for a thriving underground culture of whispered jokes, secret advice, and don't ask where I learned this kind of wisdom. You stretch your arms and recall something funny the baker said yesterday. He swore that if you eat 3 cloves of garlic and rub goat fat on your thighs, you'll never get caught cheating. Everyone laughed, but only after looking over their shoulders. Now, speaking of cheating, hold that thought for later. Right now, we're still in the bedroom. And in that bedroom, things weren't always straightforward. The idea of consent was murky. Marriage vows implied lifelong sexual access, but that doesn't mean everyone was happy about it. Marital rape wasn't recognized. A woman could be beaten for refusing her husband, though most sources suggest that's not how all couples behaved. In fact, there are accounts, especially in peasant households, of spouses sharing work, laughter, and quiet moments. Love existed. It just had to sneak around the theology. Meanwhile, birth control was its own sort of underground operation. You've probably heard that contraception didn't exist in the Middle Ages. Wrong, it did. It just wasn't legal, safe, or effective. But people tried anyway. One popular method? Jumping up and down after sex. Another? Drinking a potion of herbs and wine, usually including things like pennyroyal, tansy, or even mercury. Do not try this. Some women tied weasel testicles around their thighs. Some used wool soaked in vinegar as a kind of primitive sponge. Desperate times, desperate methods. You remember old Marta, who lives on the edge of the village. People say she knows 100 ways to make a baby disappear, if you bring her the right coin and a lock of hair. Her garden grows strange plants. Her eyes are cloudy, but her advice is sharp. You're not sure if she's a healer, a witch, or both. But every time a young woman disappears into the woods with a bundle of herbs, well, people notice. And then they pretend not to. You lean against the wall and sip from a wooden cup of watery ale. Morning's half gone. Someone is herding pigs nearby. You hear the distinct squelch of someone stepping in something they shouldn't have. Your partner glances at you, a smirk. Maybe later, tonight, when the fire's lower and the cousin's asleep. You both know how to move quietly. You've gotten good at that. The soft rustle of fabric, the strategic cough. It's not ideal, it's not glamorous, but it's real. And when you lie down again on that scratchy straw mattress, maybe you'll think about all those rules. About how much of them you ignore, about how medieval people managed to make space for love, lust, and laughter in a world designed to make them feel ashamed of it. Because at the end of the day, behind the sermons, the sin charts, and the damp walls, People were still people, and they still wanted to be close, even if it meant sleeping next to a goose. The sun slants low now, golden and hazy through the smoke, drifting from every crooked chimney in the village. You're helping haul a bucket of water back from the communal well, trying not to slosh your already slippery clogs, and someone nearby is having a very loud argument about cheese. Again. But your mind is somewhere else, on something heavier, stranger, louder than cheese and harder to explain. You're thinking about sin, not abstract sin, the kind that floats around in sermons, but the personal kind. The kind that shows up under furs on a cold night or behind a haystack when nobody's looking. Because you've heard the whispers. The baker's son, who supposedly kissed someone behind the church. The widow who's been seen with the traveling minstrel. The nobleman who paid a priest extra to forget something. Everyone sins. The real question is, what's it going to cost you? Welcome to the world of forbidden desires and sin taxes, where guilt is the default setting, and the church doesn't just save your soul. It taxes your horniness. See, the medieval church didn't play around when it came to regulating sex. And we're not talking casual Sunday lectures. We're talking fire and brimstone, tally your deeds, stare you down in the confessional booth intensity. The church had rules for everything. What kind of sex you could have, with whom, how often, in what position, and, seriously, on what days. You probably know that Lent was a no-go. But did you know that Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays were also off-limits? That's almost half the week. Add to that feast days, of which there were a ton. Fasting days and days when someone in your extended family had died within the past month. Suddenly, your calendar is emptier than a monk's love life. Historians still argue whether people followed these rules out of deep spiritual belief, or because they were just afraid of public humiliation and eternal hellfire. Realistically, probably both. Fear is a hell of a motivator, especially when paired with a sermon about eternal flesh-melting torment. Now let's talk penance. Imagine this. You confess that you had sex with your spouse on a forbidden day. You're told to fast for a week, kneel for 4 hours a day, and recite the Psalms backward. Oh, and no meat for 3 Sundays. All for doing something that technically created life, but on the wrong day. What if it was with someone you weren't married to? That's a public flogging. Maybe exile? Possibly getting locked in stocks for the whole village to see. And if you were a woman? Yikes. Reputation shattered. Dowry gone. Good luck remarrying. And here's the weirdest part. You could pay for absolution, literally, indulgences, donations, gifts to the church. If you had money, you could sin and then purchase forgiveness like it was a medieval loyalty program. Sex with a servant? That'll be 3 silver coins and a candle offering. Adultery? 10 coins and a new altar cloth. Nobles gamed the system. Peasants just got punished. One scribe wrote about a local lord who slept with over a dozen maids over 10 years and paid the church handsomely to stay on its good side. Each affair was followed by a generous tithe and a fresh round of prayers. Meanwhile, the maids, branded as impure, dismissed, sometimes forced into convents against their will. You pass by the chapel now, eyes trailing the stone tower that casts a long, cold shadow across the market square. The priest stands outside offering blessings to passing merchants, but his eyes linger just a moment too long on the young girls carrying baskets. Everyone notices. Nobody says a word. And then there's you. You're in a marriage that works. It's not always passionate, but there's comfort. There's a rhythm. You know the rules. But sometimes you miss a step. Sometimes there's a hunger that doesn't fit neatly into the moral chart hanging behind the confessional curtain. You remember what it felt like to sneak away behind the barley shed. The thrill. The guilt. The worry. That night kept you awake for days. Not because of fear of disease or scandal, but because of what it meant for your soul. Guilt is the real currency here. It fuels obedience. It makes you line up for confession, drop coins in the offering bowl, and apologize for things you don't even fully understand. and it's exhausting. And yet, the church still depended on your confession to function. Public sin meant public penance. But private sin? Oh, that was where the real power lay. Because you'd carry that shame with you every day, every time you knelt at Mass, every time you made love and then wondered, was this okay? Did I do it wrong? There were even sex manuals, not the fun kind, sorry, that listed what was acceptable. The Decretum Gratiani, the Penitentials, and dozens of other monk-authored handbooks tried to map out moral intercourse like it was a road to salvation. They detailed what positions were allowed, only one, what acts were unforgivable, many, and when even married couples had to abstain, often. And here's the strange twist. These same texts revealed just how creative people were getting. You don't outlaw a thing unless someone's already doing it. Which means, yes, people experimented. They whispered about it. They lied about it. They swore it wasn't them. But they did it. You pass a stall selling goose eggs and root vegetables. The old woman behind the table gives you a wink that feels both suspicious and somehow encouraging. You can't help but smile. Because even under all the pressure, the fear, the scolding sermons, people still laughed. Still flirted. Still wanted. Desire is like water. You can build a dam, but it'll find a way to seep through. Take the case of Emmeline of Dunshire, a farmer's daughter turned alewife. She was known for her thick brew and her thinner patience. After her husband died, she lived alone. Too long. Gossip spread. One night, a monk was seen leaving her cottage. A few days later, a fine was paid. Emmeline stayed put. Business boomed. People still whispered, but now they bought more ale. You reach your doorstep again, bucket sloshing. The door creaks open. Your partner's at the table, slicing carrots. You lock eyes. Just for a moment. There's warmth there. Real intimacy didn't come from religious approval. It came from surviving another day together. From secret touches, long silences, small acts of kindness that defied doctrine. As the sky turns deep blue and the hearth glows again, you remember the words from last week's confession. Do penance and sin no more. Sure, right after dinner. It's a market day in the village square and you're weaving between stalls selling wilted greens, cracked pottery, and questionable cheese that smells like ambition and regret. Someone's juggling turnips for coins. A dog is fighting a goose. The butcher's yelling about pork. But you're not. Here for groceries. You're here to look, and what you're looking for is someone. Because here's the next question in your medieval misadventure. Who exactly were you allowed to touch? And how the hell did you even know? You pass by the blacksmith's apprentice. He nods at you. Could you? Should you? What about the carpenter's widowed daughter? Or that suspiciously charming tanner who always smells like oak bark and sweat? In the 21st century, flirting is confusing enough. But here in the 14th, it's a legal obstacle course with the church acting as your passive-aggressive referee. Marriage isn't about love, it's a contract, a business deal. Property changing hands, names being linked, cows being traded, and debts being forgiven. And if you're poor, you barely get a choice. If you're rich, you get less. Nobles rarely married for affection. Dynasty came first, personal feelings. Fourth or fifth. Your parents likely chose your partner when you were still chasing chickens in the yard. And if they didn't, the local priest or lord had a say. Everyone wants a piece of your future, even if it means you'll spend your life next to someone whose idea of foreplay is burping after soup. You pass two peasants gossiping. One whispers about a couple caught in a non-consensual union. Not because of force, but because they got married without permission from a bishop. Yep. You could fall in love, get hitched, and still be considered in sin if you forgot the right paperwork. Historians still argue whether most of these unions were tracked or just quietly accepted, especially in rural areas where priests were few and peasants were many. But technically, Unauthorized marriage could be annulled. Children declared illegitimate. Property seized. Fun, right? Now here's the scandalous twist. People found ways around it. There was something called hand fasting, a kind of unofficial marriage ceremony where two people would declare themselves wed in front of witnesses, or even just each other. In some regions, this was considered legally binding if followed by consummation. Other times it was a loophole for lovers who couldn't wait for the next visiting bishop. In other words, sleep together, then pray it counts. Meanwhile, noblewomen had even less say. A duke's daughter could be married off at 12 to a 40-year-old merchant in exchange for 6 barrels of wine and a border treaty. Her virginity was political capital. Her body, negotiable. Some girls entered convents just to escape the meat market. Others were sent to convents because their dowries weren't big enough to secure a marriage. Either way, choices were limited. Your gender, your class, your family, your dowry, they all decided your fate before you even hit puberty. You slow your pace near the cloth merchant stand. Bright red wool, far too expensive for someone like you, but it's pretty to imagine. Across the market, someone laughs, a real laugh. You look, it's the baker's boy chasing after the candlemaker's daughter. She throws an apple at him, he catches it. It's silly, it's sweet, and it's probably forbidden. Because there are rules about who you can marry, and not just about class. Incest laws stretched out to the 7th degree of consanguinity. Translation? If you shared a great-great-great-great-grandparent, you needed special church approval. In small villages, that meant most people were technically off-limits. Enter the dispensation letter, a fancy document from a bishop or pope saying, "Sure, you're third cousins, it's fine." These were expensive and often involved bribes, favors, or family secrets, because nothing says eternal love like needing a bureaucratic loophole to avoid damnation. You pass by the scribe's booth. He's got ink-stained fingers and a scroll half unrolled on his lap. Someone is paying him to write a marriage contract. He doesn't even look up when you walk by. He's seen too many names, too many broken promises. Most marriages here aren't romantic, they're strategic. But that doesn't mean passion doesn't exist. In fact, it makes it more intense. Because when you're told you can't have someone, that's when every glance, every accidental touch, every too long conversation feels like a spark in a pile of dry thatch. You've heard stories. The woodcutter's son and the washerwoman's niece. The baron's second wife and her husband's steward. Love letters hidden in shoe soles. Meetings under moonlight. People risked everything for a few moments of warmth, for connection. And when they got caught, sometimes they were forced apart. Marriages annulled, lovers sent to different towns. But sometimes, people just looked the other way. Villages were small. Everyone knew everything. But sometimes the gossip burned itself out, and the couple stayed together. You duck under a canopy to avoid a sudden drizzle. Rain tapping on the canvas like distant drum beats. Next to you, a young man and woman huddle close. Not touching, but definitely thinking about it. She looks over, blushes, turns away. He says something about the weather. Classic. You grin. Because despite everything, the rules, the laws, the lectures from red-faced friars, desire still lives. Hidden, sure, but stubborn. And what about consent? Tricky subject in medieval times. The church required mutual consent for a marriage to be valid. Both parties had to agree verbally. But in practice, that didn't always protect people. Marital rape wasn't a concept. Spousal rights overrode personal comfort. And yet, in personal letters and local records, we still see traces of affection, care, and yes, mutual love. Some couples waited for each other, wrote love poems, shared chores, protected each other from in-laws and village scorn. The world wasn't full of villains and victims. It was full of complicated people trying to navigate a web of shame, rules, and real emotion. You walk home under the wet sky, thinking about all the people who've had to love in secret, who defied expectations, who married for money, then found real affection anyway. Or didn't. life was messy, and love even messier. Back at your hut, your partner has laid out supper, lentils and bread. The cat is licking something suspicious. You sit down. The rain softens. And for a moment, everything feels simple. But you know it's not, because tomorrow someone will be fined for kissing the wrong person. Someone will sneak a letter under a door, and someone will whisper a name in the dark, hoping no one else hears. You wake up stiff from the floorboards. Turns out, sleeping next to the fire in someone else's house isn't nearly as romantic as the songs make it sound. Your back is cracked in 3 different spots, your hip is numb, and there's a draft coming in from somewhere that's making your ankles question every life choice. But you didn't come here for comfort. You came here for confirmation. Because today is the noble wedding, and you're not invited. But, like everyone else in the village, you'll be watching closely anyway. Not the ceremony, that's long over. The vows have been exchanged, the rings blessed, the wine spilt on someone's lap by a page who probably just got whipped behind the stables. No, what people really care about happens tonight, and it involves blood, specifically whether there will be any on the wedding bed sheet. Because in the medieval world, love and sex weren't private matters. They were spectacles, proof of virtue, evidence of ownership, and in noble marriages, they were political. You step outside and join the slow current of villagers, drifting toward the edge of the manor grounds. No one says it out loud, but everyone knows why they're here. They bring bread, sit under trees, pretend they're just passing time. But what they're really waiting for is that moment. Tomorrow morning, when the sheet is hung out of the window, proof that the noble bride was untouched until this night, and the union has been successfully, gloriously, legally consummated. You squint up toward the upper floor of the hall, the bridal chamber. The shutters are still closed, but soon the couple will be escorted up there. Not alone, of course, there'll be witnesses. Not in the bed, thank God, but in the room. Watching, blessing, confirming. Because in a world without pregnancy tests or paternity DNA or even remotely decent gossip boundaries, a bloody bedsheet is the medieval equivalent of a contract signature. You remember how it works. The couple, usually teenagers, are stripped down, pushed into the bed like goats being herded into a pen, and left there with the entire household pretending it's not weird. Sometimes someone waits just outside the door. Sometimes someone stays inside, claiming to observe for moral support. There are stories, always stories. Like the Baron's daughter who was so terrified she fainted, or the Duke's son who couldn't stop sobbing, or the infamous Count who had a priest recite psalms through the entire act to keep the devil at bay. Romantic, right? You pull your cloak tighter and drift toward the kitchens. Inside, servants are whispering, passing bread and gossip in equal portions. One maid swears she saw the bride earlier, slipping something red into the folds of the linen. Sheep's blood, she whispers. Or duck, doesn't matter, just enough to stain. Another says the groom was shaking so hard at the feast, he dropped his goblet 3 times and then tripped over the dog. So the question becomes, even if there is blood, will anyone believe it? Because here's the truth, this whole system is built on illusion. The illusion of purity, the illusion of control, the illusion that 2 people who just met at the altar will immediately and successfully complete the most pressured act of their lives, while the fate of their estates hang in the balance. No pressure. You wander into the orchard and sit beneath a crab apple tree, chewing on a crust of hard bread that tastes mostly like dirt. It's quiet here, peaceful, until a page runs past, red-faced and panting, yelling something about the wine bucket being cursed and a missing boot. You sigh. It's all such a performance. And yet, it matters. Because virginity isn't just about virtue, it's about power. A noble woman's untouched status is worth land. Her innocence is currency. Her body is a promise that any future children are legitimate, that property will pass to the right bloodline, that alliances will hold. And the bedsheet, that's the receipt. Which is why so many brides fake it. There are manuals, Yes, actual written guides on how to simulate blood, how to behave afterward, what to say if someone asks too many questions. Some recommend cutting your thigh. Others suggest stuffing a bladder of wine or animal blood beneath the mattress to be subtly squeezed at just the right moment. One even recommends soaking the sheet ahead of time, drying it in the sun, then re-wetting the stain and hanging it up before anyone checks. You'd laugh if it wasn't so grim, because beneath all the rituals and songs and prayers, this is just fear wrapped in lace. Fear of failure, fear of scandal, fear of being sent home in disgrace, childless, name blackened, marriage annulled before breakfast. And the worst part? It almost never works the way it's supposed to. You think of the girl from 3 villages over, married at 15, failed to bleed, accused of having lost her honor before the wedding. She hadn't, but her word didn't matter. The marriage was annulled, her family disgraced. She now lives with a widowed aunt who makes candles and never speaks. You hear the shutters above creak open. A servant leans out, wipes the sill, shuts them again. It's almost time. Inside, the bride is probably trembling, the groom pacing, or vice versa. They don't know each other, not really. They said vows, kissed awkwardly in front of a priest, and now the entire future of their estates depends on blood. You lie back on the grass, stare at the stars, and wonder how many other couples have gone through this exact ritual, century after century. How many cried? How many laughed? How many just stared at each other in the dark and said, "Let's fake it"? Because here's the quiet truth that no bard will sing. Most people just made it work. They fumbled, they lied, they bled when they didn't expect to and didn't when they were supposed to. And in the end, they survived. Some even grew to love each other. You roll onto your side and watch the moon rise. It's fat and pale and unforgiving. Just like tradition. And in a few hours, someone will wake the household with a shout. A sheet will be displayed, and no one will ask too many questions. Because when the stakes are this high, the truth stops mattering. What matters is the story they can tell in the morning, and whether the neighbors believe it. It's a warm, sticky evening in the city, and the smell hits you first. Steam, sweat, wet wood, herbal oils, and something slightly off, like someone tried to cover up mildew with lavender. You follow a flickering lantern down a narrow stone alley, deeper into the scent trail, until you arrive at a door with no sign. Just a carved symbol, 2 swans with necks entwined. You knock. Welcome to the public bathhouse, your medieval one-stop shop for cleanliness, conversation, and questionable contact. And maybe a little disease on the side. You probably won't leave clean, but you'll definitely leave changed. The door creaks open. A young woman in a loose wool tunic gives you a half smile and waves you in. Inside, it's steamy and loud. Voices echo off tile and stone. A cauldron in the corner keeps the water hot. Buckets clatter. Someone laughs a little too hard. You see more naked ankles than you're emotionally prepared for. Bathhouses in the Middle Ages were strange in-between spaces. On one hand, they were hygienic hubs, essential for scraping off months of grime. On the other hand, they were social arenas, gossip pits, low-key dating spots, and occasionally state-sanctioned brothels with extra soap. You slip off your outer tunic, fold it carefully, and keep your coin pouch close. You sit on a bench by the wall, adjusting to the heat and noise. Someone offers you a ladle of warm water. You nod, polite. They pour it over your back. Not bad. Contrary to the cliche that medieval people never bathed, many urban dwellers loved a good soak. Bathhouses were especially common in larger towns. London, Paris, Prague, where locals could visit once a week, or even more often if they had the time and coin. But the experience wasn't just about cleaning your body, it was about connection. Business deals happened here. Marriages were negotiated. Affairs ignited. If you were lucky, maybe even a foot rub. Of course, things could also get complicated. You notice a pair of men in the far corner whispering too close. A woman reclines near the stove, steam curling through her hair, her robe slipping further with each cup of wine. A monk, of all people, is in the back, head down, pretending not to notice anything, which makes you wonder why he's here in the first place. Historians still argue whether all bathhouses were dens of sin or just occasionally spicy. The truth is somewhere in the damp middle. Some bathhouses had private rooms upstairs, little curtained booths for those who wanted extra service. Others were strictly clean-only zones with separate hours for men and women, and in most cases it depended on the town, the time, and who was paying off the local bishop. Now let's talk about brothels, because while you're soaking in semi-innocent bliss, there's another building across town, buzzing with its own kind of business. Legalized prostitution was an open secret in medieval cities. Authorities often allowed brothels to operate as long as they stayed in designated zones, paid taxes, and didn't get too loud. These weren't seedy underground dens. Many were state-sanctioned, complete with madams, menus, and inspections, at least in theory. Some even had union-like protections. In 15th century Nuremberg, for example, city-led brothels had curfews and strict rules. No clients on feast days, no price gouging, and absolutely no clergy customers. You laugh to yourself, right? No clergy. Because if there's one thing that's consistent in every age, it's hypocrisy. You towel off and wander toward a back room. There's music now, a lute slightly off-tune. You pass a tray of mulled wine, a bowl of dried plums, and a stack of linen wraps that are probably less clean than they look. A woman with silver earrings offers you a smile. Friendly, maybe more. You nod politely and keep walking. Because here's the thing. In a society so obsessed with control, these places offered a loophole, a release valve. The church thundered about chastity, but the city let you rent intimacy by the hour, provided you paid your sin tax and kept your mouth shut. And people did. Men of every class. Sometimes women too. There's a record of a nobleman in Florence who visited the same brothel every Friday for 10 years and gifted one of the girls a silver ring engraved with her name and a saint. He later married someone else. Of course, but he kept the ring. You reach a quiet corner of the bathhouse. The heat is heavier here. Candles flicker low. A couple sit side by side, not speaking, just soaking. Their hands brush. Once, twice. You turn away, giving them privacy. Because despite everything, the judgment, the risk, the absurdity of public nudity under church rule, people still wanted to feel close, to touch, to be touched, to remember what it's like to feel seen, if only for an hour. But then, of course, if the plague happened. Suddenly, bathhouses, these havens of connection and cleanliness, became suspect. People feared that warm, shared water spread disease. Public bathing fell out of favor. Cities shuttered their tubs. The church doubled down on moral hygiene. Cleanliness became associated with vanity. And so, for centuries afterward, people went dirtier, but holier. You can still hear echoes of it now. Filth protects the body. Sweat cleans the soul. It's as if medieval Europe traded bathwater for virtue and everyone got lice in the deal. You return to the main hall of the bathhouse, slightly pruny and more relaxed. The crowd has thinned. Someone sings softly in a corner. A couple argues over a towel. The steam swirls upward like incense. And for a moment, this place feels sacred in its own imperfect way. Because yes, sex and shame often walked hand in hand in the Middle Ages. But in spaces like this, public, chaotic, vulnerable, something else crept in. Honesty. Here, you didn't have to pretend. You didn't have to confess afterward or justify your hunger. You could just be a body, sitting in a warm water, trying to forget the cold world waiting outside. You wrap yourself in rough wool and step into the night air. The bathhouse door swings shut behind you. Tomorrow, someone will preach about purity. Someone will write a letter condemning unclean acts. But tonight, you were just human, and you were never alone. You wake up to bells, not church bells, those would be too predictable. These are softer, smaller, tinkling, almost musical. They drift from the abbey orchard where the nuns are already gathering apples, singing as they work. You're on monastery grounds this morning. You've been here for a few days, helping mend a crumbling stone wall in exchange for food and a warm place to sleep. But something's off. The monks are quiet. Too quiet. Not the prayerful, peaceful kind of quiet. The awkward kind. The kind where everyone knows something they're not saying. Last night, a candle flickered in one of the towers far later than it should have. And this morning, Brother Matthias has dark circles under his eyes and is avoiding eye contact with Sister Celeste. Which is wild, because monks and nuns aren't supposed to be looking at each other, much less sneaking into each other's towers. You stretch, crack your back, and smile to yourself. It's time to talk about lust in the cloister. Because for all the vows of chastity and the hours of Gregorian chanting, the monastic world wasn't exactly the sexless desert your history teacher made it out to be. It was full of real people. And real people get lonely. Let's start with the basics. Monks and nuns were supposed to be celibate. Totally celibate. Not just physically, but emotionally. Their only love was supposed to be God. Their only intimacy, prayer. But you try living in a dim stone building with the same dozen people for 20 years. No alcohol, no escape, and no conversations that aren't about wheat yields or divine mercy. And see how your resolve holds up. Historians still argue whether the average monk actually upheld their vow of chastity. Some did. Many tried. But others? Well, one 14th century report from an English abbey described a secret tunnel dug between a convent and the neighboring monastery. Used for what, you ask? Oh, just midnight spiritual conversations. Right. Another monk, known only as Brother Thomas, was banished from his order after it was discovered he had fathered 12 children with a local widow. That's not a vow of chastity. That's a full-time side hustle. And those are just the ones who got caught. You wander through the garden, hands brushing against thyme and rosemary. Two young monks are talking softly near the stone wall. They stop when they see you. One adjusts his robe, the other coughs. It's the secrecy that's so telling. Monastic life was designed to strip away earthly desires. Meals were bland, beds were hard, walls were high. The architecture itself was meant to keep temptation out, but it couldn't keep it from growing inside. Because here's the thing about desire. When you push it down too hard, it doesn't disappear, it mutates. It sneaks into dreams, it shows up in poetry, in stolen glances, in long confessions that take too long. Some monks wrote about it openly, in veiled metaphors, of course. They described divine longing as being pierced by love, or consumed by the fire of union. If you think that doesn't sound suspiciously erotic, I invite you to reread some of the Psalms. And it wasn't just the men. Nuns, too, found themselves tangled in emotion and longing. In the 12th century, the abbess Hildegard of Bingen, yes, Saint Hildegard, wrote music and visions full of sensual language. She spoke of the sweet touch of grace, and a fire within the soul that burns but does not consume. Was she just being poetic? Maybe. Maybe not. One lesser-known mystic nun, Mechtild of Magdeburg, described her love for God in terms that made medieval bishops sweat through their woolen collars. She wrote, "I want to melt in his embrace, fall into the wound of his love, be filled with his longing until I dissolve." You gulp. Is this a prayer? Or a love letter? You make your way toward the chapel. Inside, the scent of beeswax and old wood lingers in the air. A choir hums somewhere behind the wall. You slide onto a bench and look up at the high arch ceiling. You wonder how many secret lovers have passed through here. How many confessions were whispered into stone? How many hearts cracked open behind those robes? Because this wasn't just about lust. It was about connection. Many who entered monasteries didn't do so out of spiritual passion. They were forced. Youngest sons, surplus daughters, widows without dowries, illegitimate children. The church became a refuge, but also a cage. And within those walls, relationships bloomed. Sometimes romantic, sometimes protective, sometimes desperate. There are records of monks forming deep emotional bonds with one another, of nuns carving each other's names into wooden bedposts, of letters that spoke of longing too tender to be purely platonic. Was it love? Was it sin? Was it survival? Probably all three. You hear footsteps behind you. Brother Matthias slips into the chapel, kneels silently. His shoulders are tense. His hands shake. You don't ask why. But later at supper, you catch a moment between him and Sister Celeste. A look, brief, barely there, but unmistakable. There's a history behind it. Maybe a regret. Maybe not. And you think, chastity might be about the body. But connection? That's something deeper. Something no wall, no vow, no bishop can really control. As night falls, the abbey bells ring again. You lie on your straw mattress in the guest hall, wrapped in a woolen blanket that smells like dust and time. And somewhere in the shadows, behind carved doors and quiet prayers, love continues. Unseen, unspoken, but alive. You're sitting in the shade of a crumbling stone wall, chewing a piece of hard bread that tastes vaguely like regret, when someone walks by in a long cloak, hood drawn low. You look up, barely interested at first. Just another pilgrim or scribe passing through the village. But then the figure turns a little, just enough for you to catch the glimpse of a smirk. The way they glide more than walk. The silk flash of a tunic under the rougher cloak. And you get that tingle. That instinct that something here isn't what it appears. Which is how you find yourself whispering, later that night, in the corner of the tavern, about the most hidden subject in all of medieval society. Queerness. That's right. The Middle Ages weren't exactly bursting with rainbow flags, but that doesn't mean queer people didn't exist. They did. Of course they did. But their stories were often buried under ink, shame, or rewritten into silence. Still, if you know where to look, the hints are everywhere. Let's start with the language. In letters, in poetry, in spiritual texts, you'll find words that don't quite line up with the strict binary roles the church loved to preach. Men writing to other men in breathless adoration. Women penning verses to other women with lines like, "Your mouth is the well from which I drink." Okay. Historians still argue whether these were coded expressions of deep platonic friendship or disguised romantic passion. But when you compare the tone to letters between husbands and wives, which are often about grain yields and please stop feeding the dog scraps, you start to suspect there's more going on here. Take Richard Rolle, a 14th century mystic who wrote intensely personal letters to male followers, or the Benedictine nun who wrote of a bond of fire shared with her spiritual companion, another woman. Or the troubadour songs of 12th century southern France, where one female poet openly sings about longing for another woman's embrace. These weren't random. They were the quiet heartbeat under a very loud, very controlling church structure. You finish your bread and make your way toward the candlemaker's shop. You've heard rumors about them, the way they never married, the way their apprentice, same gender, has been with them for 10 years, the way they speak to each other in half sentences and long pauses. People say things, of course, but no one acts on it. Because the reality is this: queerness wasn't always prosecuted. Sometimes it was ignored, sometimes it was tolerated, so long as it didn't cause scandal. Other times, yes, it was punished harshly. Torture, exile, burning. Especially if it became a public problem or got tangled with politics. But in many places, especially in rural areas, it just lived quietly, in glances, in poems, in the back of a barn or the edge of a forest. You pause outside the shop. You hear laughter inside, low and soft, the kind that only comes from shared comfort. You don't knock, you don't interrupt, you just listen. And you realize something. The Middle Ages were rigid, yes, but also full of cracks. And in those cracks, people found space to be. They used code, a flower given at the wrong season, a saint referenced in a carved ring, the color green, a hand held just a little too long, letters folded twice instead of once. All these things whispered messages that would get you burned if shouted. In Florence, there were underground communities, brotherhoods, sometimes literally, where men found company, affection, and occasional safety. In convents, some nuns formed lifelong spiritual partnerships that many modern scholars read as romantic, or even sexual. These relationships were called particular friendships, and the church tolerated them until they didn't. You think about the couple you saw yesterday in the bathhouse. Two men, sitting shoulder to shoulder, silent but unafraid. You think about the noblewoman in the scribe's tale who refused 3 suitors and built a home with her childhood friend instead. You think about that monk's poem, "He is my mirror, my soul's rest." To sleep beside him is to know heaven. That's not metaphor, that's longing. But the risk was real. In some places, sodomy was punishable by death. In others, by public shaming or mutilation. Often the law was vague, leaving punishment up to the mood of the judge. And if you were a noble or a cleric, you could buy your way out. If you were a peasant, good luck. Yet people still risked it. Still loved, still touched, still built quiet lives in the shadows. And it's not all tragedy. Some lived peacefully, unbothered, especially women. Female same-sex intimacy was often dismissed or misunderstood by male authorities. After all, if there was no man involved, how could it even be real? Eye roll from the 13th century. You sit by the river now, watching the moon reflect in the black water. Somewhere behind you, someone sings an old folk tune, soft and slow. And next to you, a figure sits down. Doesn't say anything, just sits, close. You don't look over, you don't need to. Because tonight, in this tiny village with its dirt streets and loud priests and worse ale, you understand something that no history book ever really says. Medieval people were people. And queerness, like desire, like loneliness, like hope, has always existed. It just wore different clothes. A pilgrim's cloak. A monk's robe. A smile held for a second too long. You wake to the sound of a goat coughing. Violently. It's just past sunrise and someone's already banging on a pot in the yard to scare birds off the barley. You sit up, dazed, hay tangled in your hair, mouth dry, and vaguely annoyed that you've been dreaming about kissing someone with an herbalist's hands and the voice of a bishop. You shake it off. But that dream, it's sticking to your ribs like bad porridge. Because you'd gone to bed last night with something strange under your pillow. A bundle of dried rosemary tied with red thread and tucked inside a linen sachet. You didn't put it there. And it smells like the kind of thing old Marta would sell for stirring the senses. You look around. No one in the house is awake, not even the cat. You lean close and sniff it again. Yep, that's love magic. Let's talk about it. Because in a world where most people couldn't read, doctors used astrology to diagnose you, and dreams were considered divine messages, love potions and witchy tricks were very much part of the romantic toolkit. You stumble outside into the fog. A cart rattles past and the driver's chewing on a clove of garlic, mumbling something about warding off sinful thoughts. Behind him, you spot Marta herself, bundle of herbs on her back, chicken under one arm, reputation trailing like a veil. You nod. She nods back and doesn't blink. Because Marta, like so many village healers across Europe, straddles the line between folk wisdom and heresy. And when it came to sex and love, she had something for every situation. Want someone to notice you? Try a brew of basil, clove, and crushed strawberries poured over your chest before sunset. Want to make a man loyal? Slip a drop of your blood into his ale. Not joking. Disturbing, but documented. Want to punish a cheater? Tie a knot in a chicken's foot while chanting his name backward under the full moon. Historians still argue whether these potions ever actually worked in a biological sense. But socially, Psychologically, they had real power. Because belief is a kind of magic too. People turned to love magic not because they were foolish, but because they were desperate, powerless, trapped in arranged marriages, unable to speak their feelings aloud. And a potion? That was something they could control. You pass a group of women at the well. One is pregnant, one is weeping, one is laughing way too hard at something whispered. You catch a phrase, the glove trick. That's an old one. You put a clove of garlic in your lover's glove overnight, and if he dreams of you, he's yours. You smile. Not because it's true, but because it might be. Later that day, you visit the church to scrub the steps. It's your weekly penance for having said bloody in front of the priest's goat. Again, you overhear the priest muttering about heathen practices. He's holding a parchment. Some poor woman caught selling aphrodisiac charms made of honey and powdered hen bone. The bishop wants her punished. The villagers just want her recipe. And here's the thing. The church hated love magic. Not because it didn't work, but because it often did. Not magically, but socially. These potions, charms, and spells gave people, especially women, an illusion of agency. And in a system where power was supposed to flow from above, that was dangerous. That's why, by the 15th century, church doctrine began to treat love magic as a gateway to witchcraft. A woman caught selling an herbal seduction blend could be accused of dealing with demons. A man who drank a potion and claimed he couldn't perform afterward might blame bewitchment. Inquisitors wrote entire manuals about it, pages and pages detailing how to identify, interrogate, and punish lust witches. One even warned that a popular love charm involving menstrual blood could bend a man's will for eternity. Dramatic, but effective marketing. You sit by the fields that evening watching crows circle above the orchard. A girl nearby is weaving something into a bracelet. Hair, maybe. You're not sure whose. She hums a tune you don't recognize. Her eyes are on the horizon, waiting. You remember when you tried love magic? Years ago, before all this. You paid 2 copper coins for a sachet of rose petals and poppy seeds. You wore it under your shirt. The person you wanted smiled at you the next day. Coincidence? Maybe, but maybe not. Because in a world where courtship is confined, speech is limited, and touching someone can get you excommunicated. Even the smallest spell feels like rebellion. Like hope. Like possibility. And magic was never just about results. It was about ritual. About doing something, anything, when the world told you to stay still. About believing you deserve to be seen. That night, you find another sachet under your blanket. New herbs this time. Different thread. You don't ask who put it there. You don't need to. Because maybe love isn't always logical. Maybe it's not supposed to be. Maybe it's a little irrational, a little unhinged. A mix of folklore, timing, sweat, longing, and crushed lavender in a clay jar. You tuck the sachet under your pillow, close your eyes, and dream of hands you've never touched. And someone, somewhere, dreams of you. You're elbow deep in sheep dung. That's not a metaphor. You're actually helping clean out the pen because Marta swore it would strengthen your back and your humility. Which is just medieval code for, I'm not doing it, so you will. As you toss another shovelful onto the compost pile, a flash of metal catches your eye beneath the hay. You pull it up. It's a weird, cold, heavy, shaped vaguely like underpants but with hinges. Hinges. You freeze. No way. Is this a chastity belt? You look around to make sure no one's watching, then hold it up like some cursed artifact from a cursed tomb, which in a way it is. There's even an iron plate in the front, with holes. For hygiene, ventilation, confusion? Welcome to the medieval myth that just won't die. Let's unpack the ridiculous, terrifying, fascinating, probably overhyped world of chastity belts. Fact, fetish, or fake? The common legend goes like this. Noblemen, off to fight in the Crusades, locked up their wives' bits in metal underwear to prevent infidelity. Key around the neck. Goodbye, temptation. And that's the story most people know. But guess what? It's probably not true, at least not in the way you think. Historians still argue whether chastity belts were widely used or even real at all during the actual Middle Ages. The earliest confirmed physical examples don't appear until the 15th or 16th centuries, and even those were likely joke pieces, displayed in curiosity cabinets alongside torture devices and unicorn horns. So where did the myth come from? A few early texts mention similar ideas. A 12th century poem jokes about a knight locking his lady's treasure, but it reads more like satire than a manual. Later on, Renaissance writers described such belts with all the exaggeration of a gossip-loving aunt. Oh yes, milady was chained like a wine barrel and couldn't so much as sneeze improperly. Actual medieval records? Strangely silent. And yet, we want to believe in them, because they perfectly fit the stereotype of the medieval world as repressed, cruel, and obsessed with female purity. A literal padlock on desire. But let's step back. Metal underwear is absurdly impractical. Hygiene? Nightmarish. Discomfort? Constant. Infection risk? Through the roof. And don't even ask about bathroom logistics. So while some ceremonial or symbolic belts might have existed, it's incredibly unlikely they were ever widespread. Most scholars now consider the chastity belt more of a Renaissance-era fantasy, or even Victorian kink rebranded as history. You toss the object into a bucket and wipe your hands. It's clearly been rusting in this pen for decades, maybe longer. The goats stare at you like they know something you don't. But even if chastity belts weren't real, the idea behind them was, and still is, very real. The idea that female sexuality must be guarded, contained, and controlled. That a woman's worth is tied to her purity. That desire is dangerous unless supervised. And in the Middle Ages, that idea was everywhere. Women were told to be modest, quiet, and obedient. Virginity was a form of currency, traded, negotiated, and verified like a land deed. And the obsession with locking it down? That started long before any rusty underpants showed up in a museum. The rules went beyond the physical. Unmarried women were often supervised constantly by parents, servants, or religious figures. Clothing had to be layered and modest. Conversation was monitored. Even eye contact could be considered flirtation. But here's the thing. People still broke the rules. Noblewomen wrote steamy letters to poets. Market girls kissed apprentices behind ale barrels. Wives met lovers while their husbands were at confession. One noblewoman in France was known to disguise herself as a man to sneak into brothels. For fun. The church tried to suppress desire. Society tried to police it. But they failed over and over again because people are not padlocks. People are messy, curious, longing, and no belt, no rule, no judgment. Heavy sermon could erase that. You wander back toward Marta's cottage, the sun warm on your back. You're still thinking about that iron monstrosity. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe it was a threat. Maybe it was real, but the bigger truth? The real chastity belt wasn't made of iron. It was made of fear, of gossip, of shame, of constant eyes. And that's the part people did wear. You pass a group of girls washing linen by the stream. One of them hums. Another rolls her eyes and tells her friend to stop daydreaming about the baker's apprentice. The third one just laughs and says, "Too late." You grin. Because somewhere in every village, someone is sneaking a kiss, slipping a note, or whispering a promise. Not because they're foolish, but because they're human. You reach Marta's door. She's sitting by the hearth, stirring something thick and green. Without looking up, she says, "Find anything unusual?" You pause, then say, "Just a myth." She smiles barely, and keeps stirring. The sun is high, the air smells like sweat and roasted onions. and you're standing awkwardly near the edge of a noble's courtyard, watching two knights pretend not to make eye contact. They're circling each other on horseback, lances at the ready, pennants fluttering dramatically. A lute player in the background strums something that might be inspiring or might just be out of tune. Children cheer, dogs bark. Somewhere nearby, someone's frying turnip cakes, and at the center of it all, one woman watching from a balcony, her sleeve carefully hanging out the window for maximum romantic impact. Welcome to the exhausting world of courtly love, where romance is endless suffering, passion is inconvenient poetry, and actual touching is almost entirely off limits. You're about to witness the most medieval form of flirting ever devised. Dangerous sports performed for someone who won't even wave back. Fun. Now let's be clear, this is not about marriage. This is about longing, wishing, aching beautifully across emotional chasms. Courtly love was a literary invention that leaked into real life, like if fan fiction accidentally became law. It starts with a knight, valiant, poor, sweaty, who pledges eternal, unrequited devotion to a noble lady. She's married, of course, usually to someone old, rich, and deeply unpoetic. The knight writes her verses, wears her token, like a ribbon or glove, into battle, and promises to serve her with zero expectation of, anything real happening. Historians still argue whether this tradition was ever truly practiced, or mostly just dreamed up by bored poets and troubadours trying to impress the next duchess. But we have plenty of evidence that people took it seriously. In one 13th century French court, a lady actually held a trial to judge whether her admirer's love poem was sufficiently tormented. He lost. The concept of courtly love helped define how people thought romance should work. It was idealized, painful, spiritual, and weirdly performative. The idea was that true love made you better, more noble, more patient, more poetic, and ideally more miserable. You watch as one of the knights falls off his horse in a not-so-graceful arc. The crowd gasps. The lady on the balcony lifts her veil slightly, maybe as encouragement, maybe to sneeze. Who knows? And the fallen knight. He smiles, because even that, the pain, the embarrassment, is part of the ritual. Courtly love had rules, and they were ridiculous. Love must be secret. Love must be between unequal social ranks. Love must never result in physical union, unless of course you're French and the wine is good. Love must be hopeless. Love must be long-suffering and poetic. You had to be lovesick to be noble. You had to write sonnets that rhymed pain with chain and flame. If you weren't pining dramatically at a window or dying of heartbreak in a field of violets, were you even trying? It sounds exhausting, and it was. But people believed in it. Not everyone, of course. Peasants mostly ignored it. They were too busy not dying. But among the educated elite, courtly love shaped how men approached women, how women presented themselves, and how relationships felt. And sometimes it got weird. You've heard stories of knights carving their ladies' initials into their own skin, of lovers fasting for weeks just to prove their devotion, of noble women demanding 10 years of service before they'd even return a smile. And still, people did it, because love was seen as a noble suffering, a moral elevation, something that purified the soul, especially when denied. You pass the scribe's tent, where someone's transcribing a love letter dictated by a young lord who apparently can't spell. The scribe sighs, writes, "My heart is a falcon tied by longing to your glove." You try not to laugh, but here's where it gets tricky. Because courtly love wasn't always innocent. It could be manipulative, performative, creepy. A man could claim suffering when really he just wanted control. Women had to navigate being both untouchable ideals and deeply human. It was a dance of masks, and sometimes those masks came off. Real affairs did happen. Letters turned into meetings. meetings into touches. Touches into very awkward cloakroom incidents that ended in scandal or, in rare cases, blackmail. But most of the time, it was about the build-up, not the act. You think back to the knight who just fell. He's limping now, helped off the field by a friend. The lady on the balcony is gone. Someone else has taken her place. A younger girl, wide-eyed, already learning how to flutter her lashes and not respond to compliments. And suddenly, it hits you. Courtly love wasn't about women at all. It was about men proving something to each other. It was about performance, valor, sensitivity, control. The woman was the object, the stage prop, the mirror they used to see themselves more heroically. You wander toward the kitchens where the servants are peeling turnips. One of them, a woman with flour on her cheek and arms strong from kneading dough, catches your gaze. She laughs when you trip over a stool, hands you a pear. No poetry, no veil, no tournament. Just a moment. A smile. And somehow that feels more romantic than anything you just saw. Because here's the thing. While nobles wrote poems and pined into goblets of wine, regular people were falling in love over bread ovens and field rows. They were dancing at festivals, holding hands behind barns, whispering secrets by moonlight without an audience. And that maybe was the real romance. Not the agony of longing, but the relief of being seen. You're not supposed to be here. Specifically, you're not supposed to be crouched behind a cider barrel in the back of the brewer's cottage, watching a married woman adjust her skirt while her lover sneaks out the back door. But here you are. And honestly, you're not even judging. You're just wondering how she timed it so well. Husband out delivering kegs, kids at the chapel for choir practice, door latch loosened in advance. It's like clockwork. Impressive, really. Until it isn't, because the neighbor just saw him leave, and now she's headed straight for the canon court. Oh yes, you already know medieval people were obsessed with sex. But when it came to infidelity, they didn't just scold you and move on. No, they documented it. Publicly, in Latin, with witnesses. Welcome to medieval divorce court, where the drama is real, the punishments are petty, and everyone has opinions. Let's be clear, there were no easy divorces. In most of Europe during the Middle Ages, marriage was considered indissoluble. Once you were wed, you were stuck, till death or divine lightning bolts. But that didn't mean people just quietly suffered. Far from it. If your marriage broke down, you had options. Complicated, humiliating options. But still, options. One of the most common was the church court, or ecclesiastical court. You could appeal for separation, which wasn't a legal divorce, but more like a formal, I'm moving out and sleeping with my goat arrangement. Grounds included adultery, cruelty, impotence, abandonment, consanguinity. Turns out you're cousins, again. And you better believe adultery was the juiciest one. The woman you just watched, if accused, she'll be summoned to the church court, possibly in front of everyone. Her husband will file a complaint. Witnesses will be called. Questions will be asked. Intimate questions. Where did it happen? How often? What time of day? Were there sounds? It's less like Judge Judy and more like a morally conflicted soap opera in a stone building that smells like old cheese. You've seen these cases before. The baker who accused his wife of lying with the tanner's son. The cooper's apprentice who claimed his husband hadn't touched him in 5 years. The noblewoman who caught her steward and her handmaid sharing more than just chores. Some got resolved. Others, total chaos. Historians still argue whether these courts offered genuine justice or just reinforced church control. Some cases ended with fairness. Separation granted, property divided, reputations mostly intact. Others ended in public penance, kneeling in sackcloth in front of the parish, holding a candle, sobbing through an apology. And don't even get us started on consent. There were rules, strict ones, about marital duties. If your spouse refused to fulfill their marital debt, you could file a claim. But proving that? Awkward. Witnesses were sometimes called to testify about noises, or lack thereof. And impotence? That was its own nightmare. If a husband was accused of being unable to perform, he could be ordered to undergo a trial. That's right, a literal test, sometimes in the presence of clergy. There are recorded cases of men being physically examined, told to prove their virility, and having that outcome written into official court documents. Imagine your greatest moment of insecurity. Now add 3 monks and a parchment quill. You pass by the church square now. A woman stands at the pillory, not for stealing, not for lying, but for adultery. Her hair is uncovered. Her blouse is torn. People jeer, but half of them look away. Because if we're being honest, everyone knows her husband's been sleeping with the goose girl for months. He just did a better job hiding it. You think about justice, about shame, about how these courts weren't about healing, they were about order, about keeping appearances, about making sure the system still looked like it worked, even when it didn't. The woman steps down, bruised but composed. She walks past you like wind. You wonder, did she love her lover? Or did she just want to feel alive? It's not just women who got caught, of course. Men were brought to court too, but they were more likely to be fined than humiliated, unless they slept with another man. Then the punishments. Got harsher. Flogging, exile. Worse. Queerness and adultery together. A double sin. And yet, people kept doing it. Love, lust, betrayal, they're human constants. The medieval world tried to legislate them, contain them, measure them in legal Latin and tear-stained confessions. But it never worked, because human hearts don't follow canon law. They wander. You return home to find your neighbor crying over her goat. Not because the goat is sick, because it was the only thing that didn't lie to her this week. You sit beside her, offer a scrap of cheese. She takes it, doesn't speak. And in that silence, you realize something. Medieval marriage wasn't just about rules. It was about endurance, negotiation, hope, sometimes pain, but also sometimes compassion. 2 people trying to make it work, failing, trying again, failing better. And when it broke beyond repair, the courts came in. Not to fix it, but to remind everyone watching what acceptable failure looked like. You glance toward the church, its bells silent for now. The brewer's wife will be summoned in the morning. And you? You'll pretend you didn't see anything, like everyone else. The castle is quieter than usual tonight. You're walking through its stone corridors, trailing your fingers along the cold walls. Torchlight flickers against faded tapestries. Battles won, dragons slain, saints looking very unimpressed with everyone's choices. But you're not here for dragons, you're here for bedsheets. Specifically, the kind that could make or break a kingdom. Because when sex wasn't being hushed or punished in medieval life, it was being weaponized. Welcome to the world of royal bedrooms and political bedsheets, where a single night's activity could determine who ruled half of Europe, or start a war that lasted 100 years. You pass a serving girl carrying a tray of wine toward the upper chambers. She raises an eyebrow at you like, "Don't ask." You nod back like, "I already guessed." Because when you work in a royal household long enough, you learn to tell the difference between diplomatic dinner and please distract the ambassador with your thighs. Let's start with a well-known fact. Royal marriages were never about love. They were treaties with linens, alliances sealed with rings and genitals. And those alliances, they came with expectations. A queen's most important job? Produce an heir, preferably male. Quickly. A king's most important job? Keep producing, ideally with his queen, realistically with whoever he wanted. You climb a spiral stair to the east wing, where the real gossip lives. Everyone talks about King Henry II, brilliant strategist, moody, and famously entangled with Rosamund Clifford, his not-so-secret mistress. He built her an entire residence in a labyrinth, like a lusty medieval escape room. His wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, wasn't amused. Historians still argue whether Eleanor ordered Rosamund's death, possibly by poison, or if that tale was poetic vengeance from a later century. Either way, Eleanor was eventually locked up in a castle for 15 years. Not for murder, just for rebelling against her husband's rule. And probably also for knowing way too much. Because here's the game. Royal beds weren't just personal, they were public affairs. After a royal wedding, the newlyweds were often led to the bedchamber in a ceremonial procession. The marriage was consummated, hopefully, and afterwards servants would report back on the act. That's right, 6 reports. There are actual records of bishops noting how long it took, whether the sheets were stained, and whether the groom seemed vigorous. One record even includes the phrase, "The act was performed with modesty and Christian joy." You gag slightly. But it gets better, because if no heir was born within a reasonable time frame, things got messy. The queen was blamed, her fertility questioned, her prayers scrutinized, and sometimes her marriage annulled. That's what happened to Anne of Bohemia, whose marriage to King Richard II lasted over a decade with no children. The lack of an heir weakened her political value, even though the two were reportedly affectionate. Meanwhile, Isabella of France was married off at 12 to Edward II of England, whose affections were more focused on his male favorite, Piers Gaveston. Their relationship scandalized the court. Gaveston was exiled, then executed. Isabella eventually raised an army to depose her husband. Love triangle? Try royal coup. You arrive now at the Queen's chambers, not a romantic space, more like a strategic command center with furs on the bed and spies behind the tapestries. The Queen isn't alone. She never is. There are handmaids, advisors, and a scribe taking notes on everything from her breakfast to her cycle. Because even her body is political. When she gets pregnant, it's announced like a military victory. When she doesn't, the court gossips. Was it the king's fault? Was she cursed? Did someone slip mandrake into her tea? And when a prince is born, bells ring. Feasts are held. God is thanked. When a daughter is born, quiet nods. Maybe a small prayer for better luck next time. Now here's the kicker. While queens were judged for every drop of blood they didn't produce, kings were free to spread their seed far and wide. Illegitimate children? No big deal, unless they tried to claim the throne. Many kings had official mistresses. Whole palaces were built for them. Their children sometimes gained titles, land, even power. Everyone knew. No one pretended otherwise. You've heard the stories. The king who fathered 16 children with 9 different women. The queen who faked a pregnancy using swaddled puppies to keep her enemies confused. The noblewoman who bore twins and claimed one belonged to her husband and the other to her astrologer. And they almost got away with it. Because royal sex wasn't about morality, it was about strategy. Every kiss had consequences. Every night had political implications. A child wasn't just a baby, it was a claim to power. A future war. Or peace. And when no heir came, that's when the divorce request started. Technically, the church didn't allow divorce, but with enough gold, guilt, and papal pressure, marriages could be annulled for spiritual incompatibility. Which, in royal terms, meant, she's not giving me a son, and I've met someone younger with better land. You sit now in the garden, away from the stone walls. The stars are starting to show. You think about all those nights behind velvet curtains. All those whispered names, hidden pregnancies, quiet heartbreaks. Because somewhere in all the strategy, real feelings still happened. People still fell in love. Accidentally, disastrously, quietly. Servants caught glances in hallways. Pages slipped notes. Queens mourned lost babies in silence. Kings occasionally loved someone they weren't supposed to. And sometimes, rarely, they loved each other. Not for land, not for alliance, but for real. Those were the stories that never made the records. But you feel them, even now. You wake up in a rush. Not from a dream, not from the rooster, not even from the cat licking your forehead again, but from screaming. The kind that's all too real, guttural, rhythmic, raw. It's coming from the house across the lane. Someone's in labor. You sit up fast, hit your head on the ceiling beam, again, and scramble out of bed barefoot. By the time you reach the door, a small crowd has already formed. Neighbors, children, a goat that always shows up when something dramatic happens. Marta's there, pushing through the cluster, holding a satchel that smells like blood, onions, and rosemary. The screaming doesn't stop. Welcome to the terrifying, sacred, barely controlled chaos that was childbirth in the Middle Ages. No midwives on bicycles here. No soft music, no epidurals, no antiseptic glimmering in sterile bottles. This is medieval labor, hard, holy, and often fatal. You step back as someone runs by carrying a live chicken. Yes, you heard that right. And you brace yourself. Let's talk about what happened when medieval people actually succeeded in making a baby. Spoiler, the real work starts now. You peer through a crack in the wooden wall and catch a glimpse inside. The room is dark, smoky from incense, and packed. No doctors, just women. Always women. Men are strictly banned. Fathers wait outside, pacing, praying, panicking. This is a woman's ritual, led by a midwife. Part healer, part priestess, part magical shield against death. Midwives were respected, feared, and occasionally accused of witchcraft, because anyone with power, especially female power, always walked that line. They knew how to turn breech babies. They knew which prayers to whisper and which herbs to slip beneath the mattress. They also knew how to lie to the priest when things went bad. The woman inside, the one screaming, is probably on her 5th or 6th child, statistically speaking. Most medieval women gave birth to 6 to 10 children over their lifetime, and many didn't live to see all of them grow up. Childbirth was the leading cause of death for women. No surprise there. Between blood loss, infection, prolonged labor, and complications nobody could explain, every birth was a roll of fate's ugliest dice. You glance at the chicken again. It's not for dinner, it's part of the ritual. In some regions, animals were brought into the birthing room to absorb bad humors. Sometimes they were placed under the bed, sometimes over the threshold. One wild belief held that if you placed a chicken's egg under the woman's chair, it could transfer labor pain from the mother to the hen. Historians still argue whether these practices were genuine folk medicine or just desperate superstition. But in a world with no germ theory and limited access to medical texts, you did what you could. Meanwhile, the religious layer hovers thick. Childbirth wasn't just physical, it was spiritual warfare. The church taught that labor pains were Eve's punishment for original sin. So, suffering during birth was seen as deserved, holy, even redemptive. If a woman died during labor, she could be forgiven all her sins if she remained faithful to the church. If the baby died before baptism, its soul might be damned. Yes, really. That's why midwives were sometimes allowed to perform emergency baptisms, pouring water over the baby's head the second it was born, even before the cord was cut. If it cried, it lived. If not, well, there were prayers for that too. You step back as the door creaks open. The midwife leans out, face flushed, apron soaked. She calls for more clean cloths and hot water. Luxuries, in truth. Most births happened with reused linens, dirty hands, and wooden tools burned only after the job was done. You think about your friend, the young woman you helped harvest barley with last summer. She died in childbirth 3 months ago. The baby survived. Her husband named it after her and then remarried. Life keeps moving. Grief folds into chores, and yet there's still hope. Despite everything, people kept trying to conceive, to carry, to survive. Sometimes it worked, and when it did, it was a miracle. You remember hearing about noble women who were isolated for weeks before giving birth, confined in special rooms called lying-in chambers, surrounded by soft cushions, holy relics, and perfumed sheets. Their labor was supervised by midwives and clergy, just in case someone wanted to document a divine vision between contractions. But for peasants, for most women, birth happened where you lived, on your own bed, surrounded by your neighbors, praying the candle didn't go out. You hear a sharp cry, thin, wet, new. A baby. Everyone freezes. Then cheers erupt, subdued but fierce. Someone laughs, someone weeps. Marta lifts the squirming infant above her head like a victorious tournament prize. The mother is pale, lips trembling, eyes half open. But she's breathing. For now, that's enough. They name the baby after a saint. Maybe Marjorie, maybe Joan, maybe a local holy figure known for miracles. Baptism happens that night. The next morning, the mother drinks warm ale, eats boiled leeks, and returns to her chores. There's no rest, no maternity leave, no clean break between life and death. You walk home beneath a sky tinged orange from the hearth fires of a dozen homes. Each one hides a story like this, grief and joy, blood and breath. And even in a world that feared women's bodies, that punished their pleasure, that tried to control every ounce of their being, life kept happening. Secretly, loudly, painfully, beautifully. You pass Marta again. She's sitting outside now, eating cheese with one hand, cradling the newborn in the other. She looks tired. You ask, will they both be all right? She shrugs, then says softly, tonight, yes. Tomorrow, that's someone else's prayer. You nod and keep walking. It's dark now. Not just night dark, but deep medieval dark. The kind where your eyes stop bothering to adjust because there's just nothing to see. The hearth has burned low. The last ember glows in the ash like a single stubborn thought. Outside, the wind shifts through the trees, and somewhere a dog howls. Or maybe that's someone crying. You lie on your straw mattress, wrapped in 2 cloaks and one very judgmental cat. Your partner breathes softly beside you, and your mind drifts toward a quiet thought that always comes when the fire dies down. What happens after all this? Not after the wedding, not after the scandal, not even after childbirth, after everything. What happens to desire when you're old? Because no one tells you what medieval intimacy looks like in your later years. The stories always end at the wedding, or the deathbed. Nothing in between. But here you are, not young, not dead, still aching, still remembering. You shift under the blanket and stare up at the roof beams. They groan with the wind like old bones. Your bones. You remember when your joints didn't click, when your back didn't seize from shoveling compost, when desire felt less like a memory and more like a spark. You still feel it sometimes, in a glance, in a dream, in the way your partner reaches for your hand when they think you're asleep. The church says to confess, to purge these thoughts, to pray them away. But you're tired of feeling guilty for being human, and you're not alone. All around you, in huts and cottages and stone manors and drafty cloisters, people your age are doing the same thing, remembering. Not just the lovers you had, but the ones you never touched, the ones you only imagined, the letters you never sent, the moment in the field, under the clouds, when someone smiled and your chest ached in a way that never fully went away. You think about final confessions, about deathbed whispers, because eventually everyone in this world ends up horizontal, on a hard bed, clutching a cross, murmuring a life into the darkness. And when that moment comes, it's not your sins you remember. It's your longings. The time you kissed someone you shouldn't have. The poem you recited in your head but never said aloud. The time your hand brushed someone's wrist and the world narrowed to that 1 square inch of skin. Hey, you wonder what the priest will ask you when you're dying. If he'll care about the stolen kisses, the late night thoughts, the awkward fumblings under itchy blankets, or if in that last moment he'll just nod and say, "You lived." Because that's what you did. You lived in a world that tried to shame you for it. You loved in a time that didn't have words for what you felt. You touched, you laughed, you dared, you made a mess of it. And still, here you are, still human, still full of stories. You reach for your partner's hand. They're half asleep, but their fingers curl around yours out of pure instinct. There's no performance here. No sin, no judgment. Just warmth. Two bodies growing older in a world that never quite made room for tenderness. But you made it anyway. In the morning, you'll rise. You'll fetch water. Mend a tunic. Feed the chickens. But tonight, you rest. You let yourself remember, and you let that be enough. And now, as the last candle flickers out and the coals turn to soft, gray dust, you let your breath slow. Let your shoulders drop. You're safe now. Nothing left to confess. No priest to impress. No bishop to fear. Just you, the hush of the room, and the steady rhythm of night. The wind outside is softer now. The cats finally stopped judging you. And your heartbeat feels like an old, familiar song. You lived through all of it tonight. The mess and the magic, the rules and the rebellion, the quiet laughter between mouthfuls of bread and the whispered names in the dark. The misunderstandings, the tenderness, the itchy hay, the glances that meant too much. It wasn't clean, it wasn't saintly, but it was real. And now as sleep pulls at you like a gentle tide, you don't need answers. You don't need penance. You just need peace. So close your eyes. Let the last echoes of this world fade into your breath. And know that somewhere in the hush, someone once loved. Exactly like you.